Hello makers, I'm Catherine with Sheer Stitchery, and this week I wanted to share a pattern review as well as a sew along for the Sonia Estep Designs Sandy Top. So let's get to it.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum.
So before we get into the sew along, I thought I'd do a quick pattern review. So the Sandy Top is basically a one-shoulder sweatshirt that comes in a couple of different views. You have a regular shirt length view, a cropped view, as well as a banded view, which comes in at about the shirt length. And in the banded option, you have the option of having cuffs, though those are interchangeable with the other two options as well. And if you choose the banded option, you also have an optional kangaroo pocket to add to the front. Now, fabric requirement is a knit fabric with not a lot of stretch. About 20% stretch or so will be good for this pattern, which means that you can use a sweatshirt fleece, which I decided to use for this one here. I will link it down below. I grabbed that from Minerva. I'll also link the pattern for you. You could use a French terry, or if you wanted something that's a little bit more drapey and kind of gives a less casual vibe and something a little more dressy, you could use a T-knit as well, and I think that that would look very beautiful as well. Now, in terms of sizing for this pattern, it comes in a 00 all the way up to a size 30. And what that means is a bust measurement for the 00 of 31 1/8 inch and a waist of 23 7/8 and a hip of 34 inches. And for the upper size range on the 30, you've got a bust measurement of 56 5/8 with a waist measurement of 52 7/8 and a hip measurement of 61 inches. So that gives a decent size range on this top for you to make. Now, in terms of difficulty, I would classify this one as a confident beginner, simply because it is a fairly easy make for you to make, and the instructions are so well laid out. Now, you also get with the download a option for a tiled version, which comes in an overlap, as well as just butting up the pieces of paper if you don't want to use the overlap, as well as an AO if you want to send it to a copy shop, or a projector file if you happen to have a projector to trace your patterns on. Now, that being said, this one comes together so quickly. Literally, it took me probably an afternoon just to whip this top up. So if you are wanting a new top for something this weekend, you could probably whip that up this afternoon. So let's get into that tutorial. Step number 1, the optional kangaroo pocket. So with this, we are going to start off with the two bands that go on the side. We are going to fold it wrong sides together, so both the right sides are facing outward. And you're just going to press that in place. And then we are going to place the raw edges together along the side of the pocket openings. Now I'm using self fabric, but you could also use a ribbing in this case for a nice contrast, and I think that that would look really beautiful. So I'm just clipping this in place, starting with both of the ends and then adding the clips along the center. And then we're just going to stitch along here. And I've also taken the liberty of serging it. So if you have knits, you can use a serger. If you don't have a serger, you don't need to do that step because knits won't fray. Then I'm just pressing that down flat. And then I am going to top stitch along the edges here. And once I am done top stitching, I am just going to fold under the top portion here. And I am just going to add a couple of pins, and I'm using glass head pins because I can continue to press with the glass head pins and they're not going to melt. Because I find when you press a knit fabric, it doesn't really stay all that well. And then what I'm doing here is I am pressing with my pins still in here because I want to ensure that there is a straight edge. So you can see this one's bowed out just slightly. So I am just going to change this just a bit. I'm just going to roll the seam out so that it looks nice and straight, give it a good press, and then add those pins back in. because if it is bowed out, you are going to see that on the finished garment. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to mark our center. I like to clip a notch just because it's a bit easier. And then we are going to find the center point on the bottom of our sweatshirt front. Both pieces are the exact same, so you just need to choose which side you want the slouch shoulder to be on. And once you've clipped that center piece, then you're going to match up both of those center notches along the raw edges here. And I'm using a pin to hold this in place. And then I'm just going to pin all along the bottom and the side. So the reason I'm not using clips is obviously I can't clip in along the center of the garment here. Then we're going to stitch along the sides, the top, as well as the bottom, creating your pocket. Now, this isn't in the instructions, but I did do little triangle stitches all along the sides to secure the edge of the pocket. So what you're going to do with that is you're just going to stitch up, and then you're going to create the first point in your triangle. And sorry about the lighting here. It was a very sunny day and I've got a window right by my sewing machine, so you can't really see what I'm doing here. But once I am done stitching this, I will pull it out so you can see that we're basically creating a triangle in each of the corners. So you can see my triangle stitches right here. Step 2, the shoulder seams. Well, you've only got one shoulder seam. So you're going to match up those 2 shoulder seams with the front and back right sides together. Just clip it in place and stitch it. And I went ahead and serged that as well. Now on to step 3, which are the sleeves. So you're going to have 2 different sleeves. So your first sleeve looks like a regular sleeve, and that is going to go on the side with your shoulder seam. Now the side that doesn't have a shoulder seam is going to be the sleeve that has the top point cut out, so it doesn't have the curve. Now the first thing that I like to do is mark my center point of my sleeve, and I've just notched it right here. And then I am going to come in and I am going to match the center seam here. So you can see that I want all of my seams to point towards the back. So I've pushed that shoulder seam towards the back, and then I'm going to clip it at the center. Next, I am going to mark the ends of my sleeve here, and then I am just going to fill the rest in with clips, just distributing that ease, and you shouldn't have to really stretch it. It should fit perfectly. And then stitch that up. And your first sleeve should look like this, just like a regular set-in sleeve would look. Now for the second sleeve, you're going to want to line it up here because this straight edge actually forms the neckline edge of your sweater. So I am going to match up the corner of the one point with the corner of that straight edge, and then follow along the curve and just add some clips in there. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side of the sleeve. And so when you have it pinned, it should look just like this. And that's your neck edge. And there's your sleeve. So when you go to take it to the sewing machine, you are just going to stitch along these lines right here. So once it is stitched, it will look just like this, similar to what a raglan sleeve might look like. And then you can start to see our sweater really coming together, and you can see we've got our shoulder up at the top here, and then right here is where your shoulder seam would be, so you do have that drop shoulder seam. Next up, we are going to flip this right sides together because we are going to stitch the side seam for the sleeve as well as for the rest of the sweater. Now, first up, I like to match the underarm, and then I'll go in and I'll clip the bottom edge and the top of the sleeve, and then just distribute my clips in between before taking it over to the sewing machine and stitching it in place, as well as serging it. I just like to do that little extra security with my stitches so my clothes last a little longer. And we're just going to stitch along those seam lines, and it'll look like this. So when we flip it right side out, it really looks like a sweatshirt now. Now on to step 4, the neckband. So you're going to take your neckband piece, and this could also be made of ribbing, and on the short end you are just going to stitch that together. Then you're going to place wrong sides together, so you've got both of the right sides facing out. And we are going to clip this. And what we're going to do here is we're going to quarter it. So I've marked the seam as 1/4 and then half that. And then right here, I am just marking the other quarter points on my neckband. Now it's really important to quarter your neckbands when you're inserting them into a garment because you want to make sure that it is evenly spaced because your neckband is always smaller than the neck opening. So right here, I am just going in and I am going to select where we have the center pieces in here, and I am quartering this. So I've got the shoulder seam as 1/4, and then center front, center back, and then I've marked on the drop shoulder where that center point is. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to match up that seam on my neckband with the seam on my shoulder seam, because I want those two to line up. I find it looks a lot more seamless than placing that seam at center back. And then I'm going to match up each of those notches that I did when I quartered my neckband and my sweater. And you can see that the neckband here is smaller than our sweater. So what I'm doing is laying it flat, and I'm just distributing that ease, pinching it down and then clipping it so that we can have a nice even distribution as we're going through the neckband. Now you could always pull this when you're at the sewing machine, but I always find I get a better result when I do this stretching and clipping first, as opposed to doing it at the sewing machine. It takes a little bit longer, but it gives you a nicer result. So once you have your neckband all clipped in place, then you're just going to stitch all the way around, and once again, I did serge that edge. And this is what it looks like. And you can leave it just like so, or what you can do is top stitch it, which I like to do. So I'm actually going to top stitch mine using my cover stitch, and I'm using a 2-needle top stitching because I want one of the stitching lines to go along the ribbing or the neckband, and one of my stitching lines to go along my sweater. So I've got 2 stitches there, and it's got a nice stitch that looks like an overlock stitch on the back. And step 5, the optional sleeve cuffs. So you are going to fold it in half, and on these short ends, you're going to place them right sides together and stitch along there. Then you are going to fold it with wrong sides together to form that cuff. And when you are folding that over, you're going to make sure that the inside seam is pointing the exact same direction throughout the seam so it is not twisted, because that will drive you bonkers on your hoodie if the seam is twisted, because you will feel it. Now I like to give it a nice good press just to really set that in place. And this one here with this press, I've actually marked the halfway point. So I am going to mark where that seam is as 1 point, and then halfway from there, I am going to clip through both layers and then add another clip to hold it in place, and then I am going to quarter it. The reason we do this is the exact same reason we do it with the neckband. Yes, it is a smaller seam. You may only need to half it as opposed to quartering it, but it does ensure that you are fitting it into the sleeve cuff perfectly and you don't have any extra ease in any areas that you might not want. So once again, I am just quartering this on my sleeve before we set that in. And then when we go to set it in on the folded edge, you're going to point that in towards the sweater, and you will have your raw edges matching. Next, you're going to match up that seam line on the cuff with the seam line on the underside of your arm, and you're just going to clip that in place. Now, what I like to do is I actually like to put a pin in here. And the reason for that is because it holds those seams together perfectly, and you will have a perfectly matched seam on your cuff as well as your sleeve. When you use the clips, they can shift a bit. So I like to strategically place that single pin and then clip along the edges. So I've stitched and serged that in place, and there's my perfectly formed seam along the cuff. And you're just going to repeat that on the other cuff as well. And if you want to top stitch it, you totally can. Step 6 is the optional hemband. So we have already created our quarter points with the 2 seams on the side as well as for our pocket. So we just need to create one more notch to mark the center back. And then we are going to take our hemband and we are going to place it right sides together, and we are going to clip along the short ends, obviously. And then we are going to stitch that in place. And just as we did with our neckband and our cuffs, we are going to fold it wrong sides together. And we are going to match up that center back seam. And then this is the point in which we are going to quarter it as well. So first we fold it in half, notch it, place your clip, and then we are going to create those quarter points. And this is probably one of the most important ones to do, as well as the neckband, because you want to really make sure that you're distributing that fullness evenly. And then I am going to match up the side seam with the side seam that has the same one as the shoulder, because we want to have all of those same seams on the same side. If you were to flip it to the other side, I like to have things matching symmetrically, and I think that that is really good. So next, you are just going to pin it in place, just as we did with the cuff, to ensure that it doesn't move anywhere. Then we are going to match up each of the notches with those clips. Once we've done that, we are going to do the same method where we are going to stretch and pinch the excess fabric and adding in those clips to ensure that we're distributing that fullness evenly throughout. And once it is all clipped, we are going to stitch all the way around as well as serge it. And the band is all complete here. Now I also decided to take it to my cover stitch and top stitch this in place with the seams pointing upwards.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum. And now that we've got our sandy top all completed, you can go out and rock it. Until next time, makers, let's get our sewspiration on.